So we've looked at tried to explain the heritable component. Why genes partially determine um, personality, intelligence, whatever. Personality particularly, and we've seen that one of the possibilities is that it's to do with changing environments that are keeping certain traits in the population, maybe to do with trade-offs, or maybe also to do with this thing called frequency-dependent selection. But why is our traits not completely determined? Why if there is an advantage to being bold, or to being a fast explorer, or to be an extrovert, why, isn't extroversion, boldness, whatever, entirely genetic? Why is that little bit left open for the environment? Does that matter? Is there a reason for that, or is it just the inability of genes to specify absolutely every trait? So let's look at a few of these. Social learning theory, I'll say very quickly we know what that is. I'll say very quickly what it is. It's non-adaptive. We just happen to learn from our environment, and that affects our personality, the parents or whoever. Chance, which is non-adaptive. Environmental calibration, and we've seen that before in the developmental lecture. So-called weather forecasting, this is adaptive. And then finally niche fitting again, which is a similar version to the genetic version, but is saying that there may be niches that we occupy as a result of the environment. So let's have a look. First of all, we'll look at social learning theory. Let's go to social learning theory before here. That we acquire the non-heritable portion of our personalities through some process of Skinnerian learning. We learn it from, our parents treat us in a particular way, or the environment treats us in a particular way, and we respond to that by behaving in a particular way. So if our parents are authoritarian, we may respond by being submissive. If our parents are overly permissive, we may respond by, ourselves being pretty uncontrolled and wild. One possibility of examining this is to say, well, in this case, given that kids spend a lot of time with their parents, we may expect parents to have a dramatic effect on how they turn out, because the kids are responding to permissive parents or authoritarian parents, that kind of stuff. But this research seems to cast doubt on it. This is again behavioural genetics research with the usual provisos and problems that I've pointed out. Behavioural genetics research, although it has problems, is still extremely important and valid, because it's one of the only ways in which we can attempt to separate out nature and nurture. So although I've been critical of it, I'm being critical of it, but to put it in its context, I'm not saying it is useless by any stretch. It's extremely important. Plomin and colleagues Chipau and Niederheiser found that identical twins reared together are no more similar to one another than those reared apart. That is surprising. They're not identical to each other in personality. They don't look necessarily that identical. They look very similar. But although their genes are identical, it seems that parents aren't making them more like each other. So if you measure two kids on extroversion, who are living in identical twins measuring on extroversion, live in the same household, then the correlation between them, the concordance, will be pretty much the same as if they were reared in different households with different parents, sometimes in different cities, even different countries sometimes. So it seems like the parental environment is having not much effect. At least it's not having any effect on making kids the same. Similarly, adopted siblings, these are people, so when parents adopt two kids, so nobody in the family is related to each other, the parents aren't related to each other, neither parent is related to their offspring, and their offspring aren't related to each other either. So everybody's genetically unrelated to each other. If you get that kind of arrangement, and again look at the similarities between the two kids who've been reared in the same house, who are unrelated to each other, then those kids are no more like each other on measures of personality, intelligence, or whatever, than either one of those kids is compared to a random kid who's in a completely different family. So this was a bit of a shock, to be perfectly honest, to those people who believe that parents that grown up into the same household can make you more similar to one another. And further research on this, again from Turkheim, who we've met before, estimates that the shared environment, that is basically the parental environment, the environment that is the same between two kids, has very little effect on kids. It accounts between 0 and 10% of the variation. So if social learning is important, then these differences have to come from elsewhere, because it doesn't seem that parents are making more kids similar. Now, we may raise questions with that assumption later on, but it doesn't seem to be the case. Very interesting, in a way interesting but boring at the same time. I think boring because it's kind of like, But interesting, because something that people often don't consider is that it could just be all chance. The reason why personality traits aren't 100% heritable, and intelligence isn't 100% heritable, is because it's impossible for the genome to specify every single aspect of your traits. We've got quite a lot of genes. We've got somewhere in the region of 25,000 genes, again depending on how you count them. And although that sounds like a lot of genes, if you think of the fact that we have, billions of neurons which make up our brain, which partly contribute to our personality, and trillions of synapses in there, then those 25,000 genes are simply not going to be able to specify the brain down to the finest detail. So it could be that what happens here is that the genes specify as much as they possibly can, but how your brain develops it can't be completely controlled by the genes. It's left to fortune. So it's not saying that the genes, if you like, don't want to specify everything. Maybe they could if they would if they could, but they're just not able to, because of the complexity of the organ that is the brain. So it's chance plays a role in shaping the brain. So differences in the uterine environment can affect the way that the brain develops. Difference in the physical environment, the social environment that kids experience could again partly sculpt the brain. And it's just because that's it. The genes are controlling as much as they possibly can, but they can't control absolutely everything. So Steven Pinker, who came up with this idea, has got this quote where he says, "One twin lies one way in the womb and stakes out her share of the placenta. The other has to squeeze around her. A cosmic ray mutates a stretch of DNA. A neurotransmitter zigs instead of zags. The growth cone of an axon goes left instead of right, and one identical twin's brain might gel into a slightly different configuration than the others." So it's not saying that the differences have got any kind of adaptive value at all. It's just saying that it's not possible to do it. And if you look at cloned animals, and people actually do these things, people do indeed count the number of bristles on fruit flies and measure the life expectancy of roundworms, then you tend to find that even for cloned animals there are differences. And the differences is probably due to the fact that a certain amount of development has just to come from the natural environment, because it's not possible for genes to specify everything. So this is saying it's non-adaptive, and it may just be due to chance. Weather forecasting we've met before, so I won't labour this. And this slide, indeed, the same slide, was in the lecture on development, so go back to that if you want more detail. But basically the point is that individuals who, when they develop, it may be important for them to take into account the environment. So if the environment looks like you're going to be well looked after when you're a kid, if it looks like you've got a stable future, then you unconsciously make the decision to develop what's called a slow life history, or to maximize future reproductive success. So you tend to physically develop, mature more slowly. You develop sexually more slowly. You don't reach puberty. You reach puberty later in those situations. You tend to have fewer kids, are more concerned with stable relationships, and more concerned with investing in your kids, because you're saying the future's fine. I'm going to be around a long time to look after these kids. On the other hand, if the environment seems risky, if your parents aren't investing in you, if you're suffering abuse, moves, lack of investment from the father or the mother or both parents, then it's the situation is saying to you, hang on, it's very unlikely that I'm going to be around in many years' time. So this future is what's called a fast life history strategy, maximizing current reproductive success, where you will tend to mature sexually more quickly. You will tend to have more children, more sexual partners, more sex, and tend to invest less in these kids, because you're not going to be around necessarily to look after them, so you're tending to maximize your reproductive success. A bit like what I described with extroverts earlier on in that second screencast. The final one is niche fitting, and this comes from some research by a guy called Frank Sulloway. He says that families create niches. So the firstborn often bears parental expectation. The parents are the one with the first kid. The parents are say this is a child who is going to go to university and get a career and do really well. Whereas later children, on average, there's less responsibility on them. The parents don't have such high expectations of them. So this tends to make, he says, firstborns more dominant and extrovert in order to kind of go out and get stuff and achieve what the parents want. Laterborns furthermore, cannot compete with the older siblings. They can't, if the older sibling is kind of dominating them, they can't physically dominate the older kids because they're physically weaker. So they have to get success and parental approval by doing different things. So he argues that they do this by being more creative and more adventurous. And you'll see here that I still am unable to apparently spell the word creative properly. So later borns, and he did a study looking at 6,500 just upwards of revolutionary historical figures, and he found that more later borns are in this group, suggesting that indeed it is later borns who are the more creative. And these are people like Lenin, Thomas Jefferson, Fidel Castro, Darwin himself, Bill Gates, ex of Microsoft, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the philosopher. And he then did it. So he's saying here that later borns, there's a niche for later borns, and these later borns have to exploit a different niche to the firstborns because they cannot compete with the firstborns. In a meta-analysis of 196 personality studies, Frank Soloway found that 72 of these studies supported his predictions, 14 contradicted them, and 110 showed no effect. So kind of modest support here. 110 so showing no difference isn't that great, but the 72 supporting his predictions is better than the 14 which contradicted them. If we look at some of his research here, we find that if we correlations with birth order, so the firstborns tend to be more conscientious, negative correlations there. They tend to be less agreeable, less open to experience, less extrovert in certain respects, but also more neurotic. Note that these are correlations. They're all significant, but note this is a very big set of studies. This is 196 studies. These effect sizes are very small. You're looking at effect size, remember that, 0.4, multiply that by itself gives about 8% of the variation in neuroticism is accounted for by birth order. So these are weak effects. So it may have a similar effect, but it's not having a massive effect, birth order. So this niche idea may not be so good. Birth order, first of all, only explains a tiny amount of the variation, so it can't account for the majority of the non-heritable variation. If you're explaining, so I got that wrong, it's not 8%, it's 4 times 4, which is 1.6% for neuroticism. Apologise for that. You multiply it 0.04 by 0.04, multiply that by 100, it gives us 1.6%. So that means there's 98.4%, if my math is right, and it probably isn't, of variation which is not being explained by birth order. So that's a problem. And also it's the case that strategies that work within the family might not work outside the family. Hamilton's rule here, parents maybe love their kids unconditionally and let them get away with stuff that they would not be able to get away with outside the family. So it might be a cool and effective strategy if you want something from somebody and that person's parent to kind of have a tantrum, because the parent might eventually relent and give it to you. Probably not an effective strategy if you want something from a friend or a colleague. So strategy, and kids are probably aware that strategies within families and strategies between outside the family aren't necessarily effective. So summary and conclusions. These niche fitting hypotheses are nice because they treat humans as decision makers rather than mere slaves of caprice. It's not just that the environment pounds us into shape, we're unconsciously making adaptive responses to the environment. Evidence is still weak for most of these, but they do explain some of the pre-existing data. Plowman studies, for example, looking at the fact that parents don't really seem to have much effect. The notion that chance plays a role is certainly possible, and it is observed in many non-behavioural traits. So I think this research is still very much in its infancy, but I think there's some extremely interesting ideas, particularly the niche fitting ideas, the chance idea, which, as I say, is both interesting and boring at the same time, and also the kind of trade-off ideas and the change in environment ideas. Some interesting ideas, much of which is supported by evidence from non-human animals, which is always a powerful thing when we see variations in traits in non-human animals being potentially adaptive and heritable. Then that gives us a good cause to suspect that something similar might be happening in humans.